The gnawing ache of hunger can drive a soul to the precipice, but what happens when an act of desperate kindness rewrites the very fabric of fate, binding two disparate lives in an unbreakable, unforeseen way? Before we get into this tale, let us know in the comments where are you watching from, and subscribe if you want more content like this one. The dust on the cracked earth swallowed the meager daylight whole, painting the small cabin in hues of ochre and despair. Ilara, a silhouette against the fading sun, watched her 7 children with an ache that resonated deeper than the empty cavern of her stomach. Their small bodies, gaunt and restless, were a constant living testament to her failure, a symphony of murmuring bellies and quiet desperation. Each rustle of dry leaves, each distant dog's bark seemed to mock her, a cruel reminder of a world that offered nothing but relentless scarcity. Her husband, taken by the fever a year prior, had left behind not a legacy but a void, filled now only by the relentless gnawing of hunger. Her hands, calloused and worn from a lifetime of toil, trembled not from cold, but from the raw, unyielding fear that coiled itself around her heart, tightening its grip with every passing shadow. She had bartered the last of her grandmother's silver, a tarnished locket, for a handful of cornmeal that morning, a paltry offering quickly consumed, leaving the same, unyielding emptiness in its wake. The wind, whispering through the ill-fitting planks of their home, carried the scent of dust and the unspoken threat of another tomorrow, where sustenance remained an elusive dream. She was a woman anchored by an unwavering, almost defiant sense of responsibility. Yet the tide of poverty threatened to drag her and her brood into an abyss from which there was no return. The weight of her solitude pressed down, a tangible force, making each breath a laborious effort, each thought a burden. She was an island, besieged by waves of hardship, her spirit a flickering flame against an encroaching darkness. Her eyes, usually pools of quiet resolve, now held a glint of something sharp, something born of a mother's instinct for survival, a primal readiness to fight, even when all hope seemed to abandon her. The world outside their dilapidated dwelling was vast and indifferent, yet within those fragile walls, a mother's fierce protective love was the last bastion against utter collapse, a silent scream against the deafening silence of their fate. It was the youngest, little Mayella, whose small pointing finger broke the spell of the encroaching dusk. "Mama," she whispered, her voice a reedy sigh. "A man." Ilara followed the child's gaze, her heart leaping into her throat, a sudden cold dread washing over her. Beyond the skeletal remains of their garden, sprawled like a discarded doll, lay a figure, unmoving, indistinct in the deepening shadows. Her first instinct was fear, a protective surge for her vulnerable brood. The world outside their cabin was not kind to those like them, and strangers, particularly those found in such a desolate state, often carried trouble in their wake. But then, as a gust of wind rustled through the dying grass, a faint moan reached her ears, a sound so utterly devoid of strength, so profoundly human in its weakness, that it pierced through her initial alarm. It was the sound of a creature in extremis, on the very brink of oblivion. She hesitated, her mind warring with itself. To approach was to risk what little they had, to invite potential danger into their already precarious existence. Yet, to turn away, to leave a soul to perish on their very doorstep, felt like a betrayal of something deeper, an affront to the tattered remnants of her own humanity. Her gaze lingered on her children, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and childlike curiosity, their future hanging by the thinnest thread. She knew that any decision she made, any action she took would ripple through their fragile lives. The figure was undeniably white, a fact that added another layer of complexity, another unspoken tension in a world rigidly defined by lines that were not meant to be crossed. This man, whoever he was, carried the undeniable marker of privilege, now utterly stripped away by the raw, brutal indifference of starvation. He was a paradox, a symbol of the very system that had cast them aside, now reduced to an indistinguishable heap of suffering. A profound sense of irony, sharp and bitter, pricked at her. She, who barely had enough to keep her own flesh and blood alive, was now faced with a choice that defied all logic, all self-preservation. A sigh, heavy with resignation and an inexplicable flicker of compassion, escaped Alara's lips. She moved, her bare feet silent on the cold earth, drawn by a force stronger than fear or logic. The man was indeed white, his face pale and drawn, etched with the gaunt hollows of extreme hunger. His clothes, though now ragged and dirt-stained, hinted at a past of better means, a stark contrast to the threadbare garments she and her children wore. He was unresponsive, a mere whisper of life clinging to the edge of an abyss. He was a stranger, an unknown variable in her already tumultuous equation of survival. Yet something in the utter helplessness of his form stirred a dormant empathy within her, a memory of her own desperate moments. It was the children who ultimately tipped the scales. Despite their fear, their small hands instinctively reached out, their innocent curiosity overriding caution. Young Thomas, no more than 6, bravely offered a sip of the meager, brackish water from their only gourd. It was a gesture of pure, unadulterated kindness, a reflection of the lessons Alara had tried in vain to instill in them amidst the harsh realities of their lives. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her bones, that bringing him into their home, offering him succor, was an act fraught with peril, an audacious challenge to the unspoken rules of their prejudiced society. Yet the alternative, to let him die, was a weight she could not bear on her already burdened soul. With a strength she did not know she possessed, she and her eldest son, barely a teenager, managed to drag the man's inert form towards their humble cabin. The sheer effort strained her every muscle, each step a testament to her quiet, indomitable will. She had faced down death before in the eyes of her starving children, and this man, this stranger, represented another facet of that same brutal struggle, a stark reminder of humanity's shared vulnerability. The decision was made, not out of naive optimism, but from a profound, desperate hope that perhaps, just perhaps, this impossible act of grace might somehow, inexplicably, echo back, offering a chance at salvation for them all. Days bled into a hazy continuum of silent suffering and hesitant ministration. Arthur, as he eventually mumbled his name, was a ghost of a man, his eyes hollow, his voice a rasping whisper. Alara nursed him with the last remnants of their meager supplies, a spoonful of thin gruel, a few sips of weak tea brewed from dried herbs. Each offering was a sacrifice, a portion taken directly from the mouths of her own children, a fact that weighed heavily on her conscience. She watched him, an intense scrutiny that bordered on suspicion, yet beneath it lay an undercurrent of a strange, burgeoning protectiveness. Who was this man, stripped bare of all his former dignity, reduced to a trembling hand reaching for a morsel of food? He offered no explanations, no tales of his past, only a profound, silent gratitude that radiated from his emaciated frame. His silence was a shield, but also a mystery, an open loop that Alara found herself, against her better judgment, wanting to close. The children, initially wary, began to circle him like small, curious birds. Mayella would bring him wildflowers, faded and fragile, placing them on the dirt floor beside his makeshift bed. Thomas, with an almost adult solemnity, would share his worn wooden soldier, a prized possession. Their innocent gestures chipped away at the wall of his despair, and Alara observed the subtle shifts in his hardened features, a flicker of something akin to warmth in his sunken eyes. The irony of the situation was a constant bitter companion. A black woman, a widow with 7 hungry children, was expending her last ounces of strength and her last scraps of food to save a white man, a stranger, whose very existence was a symbol of the societal structures that had brought her to this precipice. It was a silent, paradoxical communion, forged in the crucible of desperation, a testament to the fact that hunger, in its rawest form, recognized no color, no status, only the desperate unifying plea for survival. Each day, the line between stranger and burden, between charity and necessity, blurred further, binding them in an unspoken, fragile dependency. As Arthur's strength slowly returned, so too did the whispers from the nearby settlement, carried on the wind like bitter dust. Eyes, sharp and judgmental, watched their cabin, fueled by a mixture of suspicion and outrage. It was an affront to the established order, a white man, and a stranger at that, sheltered by a black family. Alara felt the weight of their gaze, a palpable pressure that tightened her chest. Her occasional trips to the market, once unnoticed, now drew cold stares and curt dismissals from the shopkeepers. That man still there, Ilara, Mrs. Gable, her lips thin as a razor's edge, had hissed one morning, her eyes alight with a self-righteous fury. "It ain't right. A man of his kind stayin' with your kind." Ilara had simply met her gaze, a silent defiance in her eyes, refusing to dignify the woman's prejudice with a reply. She knew the danger. Rumors, like wildfires, could consume everything. Arthur, too, sensed the growing tension. He had regained enough strength to walk about the small cabin, his movements still tentative but no longer ghost-like. He rarely spoke, but his presence was undeniable, an unsettling disruption to their quiet, desperate rhythm. One evening, as the shadows lengthened and the air grew cool, Ilara caught him staring out at the darkening fields, his face etched with a profound, unspoken sorrow. A flicker of an image, sharp and fleeting, crossed her mind. A grand, columned building, a polished wood desk, and a stern face. Not unlike Arthur's, but colder, more distant. Was it a memory, or merely a trick of the light? The question hung in the air, unanswered. The children, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, clung closer to Ilara, their innocent world now shadowed by the palpable weight of external scrutiny. The simple act of compassion had spiraled into something more complex, a defiant statement against the very fabric of their society, forcing Ilara to stand firm on ground that was rapidly eroding beneath her feet. The quiet, almost imperceptible shift in Arthur began to manifest in small, poignant ways. He started to help, hesitantly at first, then with a growing purpose. He mended a broken latch on the cabin door, his hands, though still thin, moving with a precision that spoke of a past accustomed to detailed work. He sharpened a dull hoe, making the back-breaking labor in their small, barren plot marginally easier. He listened when Ilara spoke of her struggles, of the relentless fight against the elements, and an indifferent world. His silence no longer an empty void, but a vessel for unspoken understanding. One evening he sat with the younger children, patiently showing them how to tie a complex knot. His deep voice, still a little raspy, surprisingly gentle. Ilara watched him, a mix of bewilderment and a nascent, unwelcome warmth stirring within her. This man, who had arrived on their doorstep on the brink of death, was slowly becoming a quiet, indispensable presence in their lives. The irony was profound, a bitter twist of fate. A man who, by all accounts, had once wielded significant power, perhaps even judged others from a position of lofty authority, was now utterly reliant on the grace of a poor black widow. His past, shrouded in an impenetrable silence, loomed in the background, a ghost in the corners of their small home. Yet in their shared vulnerability, a fragile, unspoken connection began to form. He saw her not as a servant, nor as a figure of pity, but as a woman of immense strength burdened by a world that sought to crush her. And she, in turn, saw past the superficial markers of his race and his tattered, forgotten status, glimpsing a core of humanity that hunger had stripped bare. There were moments, brief and fleeting, when their eyes would meet across the room, and in that silent exchange, something profound passed between them, a recognition of shared suffering, perhaps, or a nascent respect that defied all the strictures of their broken world. It was a testament to the strange, transformative power of shared desperation, where the very act of survival became a radical, unspoken bond. The past, like a predator, never truly releases its grip, and Arthur's, though cloaked in his resolute silence, began to reveal itself in unsettling fragments. He had spoken only a handful of times of his previous life, vague allusions to law, to decisions, to a fall from grace he never elaborated upon. But one night a feverish dream stole his quietude. Ilara, roused by his tormented whispers, heard snatches of a forgotten world. Order must be upheld. The law is absolute, guilty, innocent. His voice, usually so subdued, rose in a strained, choked gasp. She saw him, not as the frail man she had nursed, but as a figure of authority, a stern face presiding over a courtroom, a gavel striking with a final, chilling thud. The imagery was vivid, disquieting. Later, in the harsh light of day, Ilara found a small, tarnished silver ring tucked deep within the lining of his tattered coat. intricately engraved with a seal she didn't recognize, but which unmistakably spoke of officialdom, of a position of power. She held it, the cold metal a stark contrast to the warmth of his fevered hand, and a new layer of dread settled over her. This was no common vagrant. This was a man who had once walked among the powerful, a man who, by the very nature of his former profession, might have been complicit in the injustices that shaped their world. The irony of saving him, a former arbiter of laws that likely oppressed her own people, was a bitter pill to swallow. Was his fall from grace a punishment, a karmic retribution, or was it merely the arbitrary cruelty of a world that spared no one, regardless of their station? These questions swirled in Alara's mind, introducing a subtle, dangerous crack in the foundation of their burgeoning, unspoken trust. The man who had entered their lives as a blank slate was slowly, painfully, revealing the contours of a past that complicated everything, threatening to unravel the fragile peace they had forged amidst their shared struggle. The fragile peace that had settled over Alara's cabin was abruptly shattered, not by an internal discord, but by the relentless, encroaching darkness of the outside world. The whispers from the settlement grew louder, evolving into direct threats. One afternoon, a group of men, faces contorted with self-righteous fury and racial hatred, descended upon their land. Led by a local, notoriously prejudiced farmer named Silas Croft, they carried crude signs and torches, their presence a palpable threat. "Get that white trash off your property, Alara," Croft bellowed, his voice laced with venom. "He don't belong with your kind. We won't have this abomination in our county." The children cowered behind Alara, their small faces pale with fear. Alara stood her ground, her body a shield, her heart hammering against her ribs. Arthur, who had been sitting outside, whittling a small bird for Mayella, rose slowly, his gaze meeting Croft's with an unnerving intensity that still held the ghost of his former authority. The silent challenge in his eyes, the subtle shift in his posture from a humbled supplicant to a man who once commanded respect, was undeniable. The tension was a living, breathing entity, coiling around them. It was a confrontation that had been inevitable, the clash between the desperate, unlikely alliance forged in the cabin and the rigid, unforgiving societal norms outside. Alara knew, with a chilling certainty, that this moment would define their future. Would Arthur, now regaining his strength, revert to the man he once was, detached and powerful, or would the crucible of his suffering and her kindness have forged something new within him? The lines were drawn, stark and unforgiving, demanding a choice, a stand that would either solidify their impossible bond or shatter it irrevocably, casting them back into the isolating abyss from which they had so tentatively emerged. The confrontation with Croft and his mob, though ultimately repelled by Arthur's quiet, unnerving resolve and Alara's steadfast defiance, had broken the dam of Arthur's silence. The following evening, as the last embers of the day's fire glowed, casting long, dancing shadows, Arthur finally spoke, his voice low, heavy with a burden long carried. He revealed his past, not in a rush of words but in deliberate, painful fragments. He had been Judge Arthur Caldwell, a respected, albeit rigid magistrate in a prosperous northern town. His fall was not from moral failing, as Alara had suspected, but from a fatal misjudgment, a moment of profound, almost arrogant adherence to the letter of the law over the spirit of justice. He had presided over a land dispute, a powerful corporation against a small, struggling community. Despite clear evidence of the corporation's predatory practices, he had ruled in their favor, blinded by the perceived infallibility of precedent and legal technicality, dismissing the pleas of the displaced. The decision had led to the ruin of countless families, and in the ensuing public outcry and investigation, his own corruption, not of money, but of spirit, had been exposed. He had been stripped of his title, disgraced, his reputation in tatters. He had fled, consumed by guilt and shame, drifting aimlessly until hunger and despair had brought him to Alara's doorstep, a broken man seeking a desolate end. He confessed the weight of his past actions, the faces of those he had condemned, the echoing cries of their lost futures. His admission was not a plea for absolution, but a raw, unflinching account, laying bare the flaws and moral ambiguities that had defined his previous existence. Ilara listened, her face unreadable, the revelation a stark, cold truth. This man whom she had saved was not merely a victim of circumstance, but an architect of suffering in his own right, a figure emblematic of the very system that had disenfranchised her. The air was thick with the gravity of his words, a new, unsettling tension that redefined their entire relationship. The silence that followed Arthur's confession was not empty, but thick with the weight of unshed tears and unspoken questions. Ilara's mind reeled, grappling with the stark reality of the man before her. He was not just a symbol of the oppressive system. He had been an active participant, a judge whose rulings had undoubtedly crushed others, perhaps even those who shared her plight. Her heart, a fortress built against a lifetime of hardship, now felt a peculiar vulnerability, a crack through which cold doubt seeped. She looked at her children, sleeping peacefully, oblivious to the storm raging within their mother. Her compassion for Arthur had been an instinct, pure and untainted by knowledge of his past. Now, knowing the depth of his former failings, the moral quagmire he had navigated, the choice before her was brutally clear and agonizingly difficult. Could she, a black woman who had suffered under the very laws he had once upheld, truly reconcile herself with this man? Could she allow him to remain, to become a permanent fixture in the lives of her children, knowing the shadows of his past, the complicity he carried? The societal pressure was already immense, a constant, low hum of threat. To embrace him fully would be to defy everything, to step into an unknown, dangerous future. But to send him away now that he was regaining his strength, now that a fragile, unspoken bond had formed, felt like a betrayal of the very kindness that had saved him. It was a pivotal moment, a crossroad where compassion met consequence, where personal salvation clashed with collective memory, and where the impossible notion of love dared to bloom amidst the ruins of their fractured world. The air thrummed with the gravity of her impending decision, a choice that would determine not only her own fate, but the very trajectory of her children's arduous, uncertain lives. The dawn that broke over Ilara's cabin was not just the coming of a new day, but the unfolding of an utterly improbable future. She had made her choice, a decision forged in the crucible of desperation, and a profound, almost defiant empathy that transcended the rigid boundaries of their world. She would keep him, not out of pity, nor out of a naive belief in instant absolution, but because, in the raw vulnerability they had shared, something deeper had been unearthed. Arthur, the disgraced judge, the man who had known power and now knew profound humility, had become an undeniable part of their fragile existence. It was a quiet rebellion, an unspoken challenge to the societal order that dictated such unions were an impossibility, an abomination. Their marriage, when it came, was not a grand affair of celebration and pomp. There were no guests, no joyous feast. It was a simple, solemn vow exchanged in the hushed confines of their small cabin, witnessed only by the curious eyes of her children and the indifferent, watchful stars. He stood before her, no longer a stranger, but a man profoundly changed by suffering and salvation, his eyes reflecting a silent, enduring gratitude. She, in turn, looked upon him not as a judge, but as a man stripped bare, now remade in the image of his quiet kindness. It was a union born of hunger and despair, sustained by an unlikely compassion, and solidified by a shared understanding of life's brutal, beautiful complexities. Their path forward would remain fraught with challenges, the whispers of prejudice a constant, low thrum against the fragile walls of their unconventional happiness. But in that humble, defiant act, a new truth was born. That salvation sometimes comes from the most unexpected places, binding two disparate souls in a tapestry woven not of societal norms, but of profound human connection, proving that even in the darkest of times, hope could, against all odds, find a way to bloom.